Hey folks, thanks for watching. It's Tuesday, October 7th, and yesterday, October 6th, I think marked a significant event, at least meteorologically, for record-keeping purposes. The National Weather Service out of Grand Forks released an upgraded tornado damage survey for a storm that actually occurred earlier this year in June. It was actually June 20th. Now that date is maybe best remembered by the Drought event, which moved through North Dakota. We talked about that kind of at the end of the month there, in the middle of summer. That had 100-mile-an-hour plus winds, kind of moved through the Grand Forks, Fargo area, and then into northern Minnesota. But out ahead of that derecho were a pair of supercells which produce strong tornadoes, one of which has now been upgraded to an EF5. That is the strongest on the enhanced Fujita scale, winds above 200 miles an hour. And that's significant, well, for two reasons. One, it's a very strong tornado, which occurred historically, but for record-keeping purposes, we now have another EF5. But the second more significant reason is we have not had an EF5 in the United States for 12 plus years, 12 years and a few months now. The last one would have been the Moore, Oklahoma 2013 EF5 tornado. And this drought has been peculiar. We've had a number of strong tornadoes that have been borderline EF5. It's always hard because the enhanced Fujita scale demands that we have some sort of evidence, some damage indicator of winds exceeding that 200-mile-an-hour threshold. Now, the chances that some tornado in that 12-year drought reached that at some point is very high, incredibly likely, but we didn't have any clear damage that said we can conclusively say this is an EF5. Now that has changed with this storm that occurred earlier in June of this year. The EF5 drought officially, for record-keeping purposes, is over, and some of the damage that they talk about in the storm, it is not a surprise that this one reached EF5 status. They talk about a sandpapering effect. I know the text can be hard to read in the video. Multiple large trees uprooted with the root ball and all, so literally ripping the whole tree out of the ground. And then perhaps the most sobering sort of extreme damage with respect to this storm specifically was with a train that had derailed out here in this open field. Took one of these tankers from the train and launched it 500 yards out into the field, or maybe 500 feet roughly, kind of hard to tell from this vantage point. But regardless, semantics, to take a tanker and some of these grain carts, lift them up and off the tracks is pretty extreme damage. And some of the close-up there, look at the wheels, the axles left behind on the train tracks as it ripped those tankers and threw them across the field. It was actually, because of how geometric these were, and I believe this tank was empty, but you can imagine how heavy it was, even if it was empty. How symmetric it was allowed them to make pretty accurate wind estimates, and those estimates ended up exceeding the EF5 threshold. And look at the wheels. I don't know, for some reason the wheels still stuck on the track to me seem pretty extreme. You can just imagine the winds roaring through here. If you look closely, some of the tracks are totally covered in mud. So the storm was ripping mud out of the ground and throwing it over the tracks. You can see that kind of covered up there. And further below, they released some other photos. There's those root balls ripped out of the ground. You can't see it, but some of these trees are totally debarked and smoothed down. Don't know if you can see that there. No bark left on some of these trees here. And just a really impressive tornado from earlier this year, ending that drought. It did have kind of this curving action where it moved toward the northeast initially before peeling back west. We see that with some of these strongest tornadoes historically. Greensburg, Kansas, I remember from a number of years ago, decade plus, kind of had that same bending toward the north and then back to the west as a weekend there. This tornado occurred at night. There's not a lot of great videos of it. This was actually a Ring doorbell which captured the bell, the Liberty Bell shaped updraft, and then the tornado. It's hard to see, but it's this shadow way under here, very ominously from this Ring doorbell camera. And again, some of the close-ups of the wheels still left on the track. You can just imagine the 200-mile-an-hour plus winds it would take to produce damage consistent with something like this. We could see it from satellite as well. It's kind of neat to compare, the track here with the official track from the National Weather Service. Pull that back up. So you can see that recurving track even on satellite from after the storm. And then there's the EF2, which occurred out ahead of it, which was also analyzed there. So I thought it was neat to see. I'll share that this morning. This is the 2013 EF5 damage from Moore, Oklahoma, near Oklahoma City. And pulled this one out because this is Tim Marshall. He actually aided in the survey of that storm and this most recent EF5 upgrade. He's walking through there surveying some of the damage. All right, catching us up to present day, the weather we're watching here on October 7th. I started with this view. This is the 500 millibar jet stream level winds. I did this because we can actually see what I'll call three of the most important weather events I think that I'll cover here in this forecast this morning. One, maybe kind of the most eye-catching one, is Hurricane Priscilla, now a Category 2 west of Mexico here. That's moving slowly toward the northwest. Might even be strengthening a little bit here this morning. That's going to be bringing this nice East Pacific moisture up into the southwest. So more forecast precipitation coming in for areas in here. We talked about this potential last week, even kind of early last week, and Priscilla kind of following that forecast pretty closely and bringing that moisture plume up into areas there, maybe even across the continental divide into the southern U.S. We'll look at that in a second. We actually have another tropical wave all the way over here in the Atlantic. See that just an open wave? What we mean by that is that flow is not closed all the way around. You can see it's still just kind of flowing west. There's enough of a little low pressure system. We'll have to keep an eye on that as that continues to head toward the west. And then this trough. This upper level trough over the central U.S. is at least our primary weather maker early this week for the continental U.S., at least for folks east of the continental divide. So that's bringing cooler temperatures underneath the trough. We tend to have cooler weather and then disturbed weather just a little bit out ahead of it in forms of, like showers and precipitation. Before I jump into that radar view, I did want to show Priscilla quickly. That's spinning here on infrared satellite imagery here this morning. Again, Category 2, you can see it just starting to form another burst of convection around the eye. So might see it continue to maintain strength here today, but it's inching closer to that cooler ocean temperature area near Cabo and then kind of to the southwest where it is likely to weaken, but that moisture that it's throwing up into the atmosphere is going to bring that rain chance back to the southwest. We actually have Tropical Storm Octave just to the west. That does not look particularly well defined or organized here this morning, so might be seeing Octave weakening and dissipating soon. And there's that tropical wave almost just off screen here, all the way out here in the central Atlantic. And you can see the Eastern Pacific still active. This was something that we talked about. I'll actually talk about it again at the end of the video and we go a little bit more in depth into the tropics. But with the Eastern Pacific so active, Priscilla spinning here, potentially another system coming in just behind it, that one with a 70% chance of formation. This only increases the wind shear downstream to the east, either across the Gulf or the northern Caribbean. So the chance of a homegrown system, with so much activity going on over here, decreases a bit. So while we talked about the potential near the end of September, maybe even going to like mid-October for something coming out of the Gulf, the Eastern Pacific has sort of stolen the show, so to speak. And at least as this activity is expected to continue for the next week or so, I'm still a little bit skeptical that we're going to get anything kind of developing in this region, which tends to be a problem, right, for U.S. landfalls. Underneath that trough that I talked about, we do have freeze warnings and frost advisories for the far northern plains, upstate Wisconsin and Minnesota. Maybe sparing some of the kind of major growing regions here, but certainly like north of the Eau Claire area, north of Madison, up into like the Duluth area, looking at likely freeze overnight here tonight. If we look here this morning just at current temperatures, you can see those freezing temperatures more off to the west across North Dakota, actually the Snake River, upper Snake River Valley in Idaho. Jump back, had some frost and freeze warnings there, all the way over into Wyoming, the Sandhills of Nebraska for those cooler temperatures. I'm going to update it. That was about 5 a.m. It's about an hour after that, 6 a.m. Actually, yeah, you can see some of those freezing temps filling in a bit. But further to the east, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, just this morning, still in the 40s here. And if we look at the National Weather Service, their minimum temperatures here for this morning on Tuesday lines up pretty closely with what we just analyzed. Those freezing temps more so over North Dakota, northern or northeastern Montana, searching back toward the upper Snake River Valley, but just the 40s over here in the upper Midwest. But that changes tomorrow. I'm going to take this forecast out into Wednesday. As that cold front pushes to the east, that trough comes to the east with it, getting down toward freezing in upstate Wisconsin and Minnesota, actually down into the 40s across Illinois, maybe even northern Indiana, northern Missouri, Kansas City down to 46. Take that forecast into Thursday, down maybe even into the 30s for portions of central Illinois, western Ohio, into Michigan, potentially looking at a frost and freeze event across the lower peninsula, getting down 34, like near Altoona, up into upstate New York, looking down into the low 30s. And that continues as we go through the day. Friday, again, this cold front pushing to the east. The rain will be pushing to the east with that. We'll take a look at that in a moment. This is all the way out toward Friday. We get some freezes up in New England, like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, towards central Massachusetts, before warming up on the backside. This is now Saturday and Sunday. You can see those overnight lows coming back up. temperatures surging back up as we go into next week, at least from the middle part of the country. If we look at radar here this morning, out ahead of that trough that kind of sort of draped like that, we have that predictable rainfall. And you can see that moving through Illinois, eastern Corn Belt, the Ohio River Valley, all the way back through Kansas. The stretch is actually all the way back to like North Texas with some light showers. Expecting additional precipitation activity today in New Mexico. We'll get that in a second. But this is some decent rainfall. It's not a lot. You're not seeing widespread, an inch plus in some of these drought-stricken areas. But this is an area where we've noted this fall a lot of soil moisture issues. We've seen field fires almost daily in a wide area here, especially as the winds have been creeping up here in October. So just getting some rain at least helping with some of that. And then the soil also, we just need to get some moisture in it for fall applications. Going through winter is not a time where we get a ton of water on this acreage here anyway. So going into even like spring planting implications, getting some of this moisture here will be beneficial, but it's a pretty quick shot. So not seeing widespread heavy amounts outside of like some areas down here in the middle Mississippi and Ohio River Valley. See that a little bit over the last 24 hours where some of the higher values up near 2 inches near Memphis along the Mississippi River, kind of along that cold front across the Midwest. Not seeing super high values, but you are nearing like an inch in the observed precip over the last 24 hours. You can see some of this along the Ohio River Valley as well. Again, this activity is going to push further to the east today. We can see that just looking at the 3-kilometer NAM, their 60-hour forecast for that forecast precip along the Ohio River Valley up into the eastern Corn Belt, looking at an inch and a half plus over to Pennsylvania, New York, New England. Areas like Michigan, southern Wisconsin, Illinois, not quite seeing as much, a lot spottier amounts, more variable, even up like north near Kokomo, South Bend, Lafayette, maybe missing out on measurable precipitation depending on if these storms kind of stay together that I showed just a second ago. If these kind of persist to the east, this area fills in a little bit more, but there's some question if they might weaken here this morning. That's not uncommon. I did want to jump back. This is the 850 millibar view. So looking at the winds just off the surface. Now, we talked about Priscilla already, octave to the west. That's actually not what I pulled this view up for. I'm going to pull this over a little bit here. One, if we look at that forecast for precip, just from the NAM, you can kind of see this, at least over the continental U.S., this is the area with the main amount of focus for heavier precipitation. Now, it's not a surprise to see that because we have a rest return flow, our moisture coming out of the Atlantic, kind of right up into that corridor here. But we have another little flux of moisture coming into New Mexico and like West Texas here. Do you see that? Pumping up here. So that's actually bringing those precipitation estimates up. If we jump back, those accumulated precipitation, maybe even something of a flash flood threat here at some of these elevated towns for Mexico. So keeping an eye on that here today. But it does bring up another point. If we look down at the Gulf and we track some of the moisture return here, this isn't great moisture return for the central part of the U.S. or even over here in the Mid-Atlantic. I know we're getting some rainfall in here, but it's kind of this stunted Bermuda high, which doesn't have that moisture track all the way through the Caribbean up through the Gulf. You kind of have a split, almost like a split return. We have some of that return coming up like this. The Atlantic is a little bit cooler over here versus the Gulf. And then you have another kind of split going like this. And we've seen a lot of systems, before they develop, just kind of race this way before getting on our board. So this is partially responsible for the drought, and it's partially responsible for the fact that, we haven't seen a lot of tropical storm or hurricane activity in this area. It's actually a 10% chance we get a little storm to maybe spit up here in the Bay of Campeche, but again, that's forecast to quickly move to the west over Mexico. If we got in the long range, this is the 500 millibar height forecast. I'm going to start with the ECMWF here today. I'll make this valid. Let's see if I can reset this, make it valid at like 7 a.m. here on Tuesday. There's that trough that we talked about, centered over Wisconsin. If I play this forecast forward into Wednesday, you're going to see that shift over New England. Ridging coming in behind it, that brings those temperatures back up near the end of the week for the central U.S., the plains, just where we were talking about the frost and freeze. See a trough moving into the western U.S., spinning just off California and Oregon on Friday. Another little system tries to sneak through Illinois this weekend, but I don't think that's going to have much precipitation associated with it. We're seeing a little bit of a trough develop here over Florida and Georgia. Now that could be relevant for spinning up one of these coastal lows again near the Carolinas. That could bring some heavy rainfall like this weekend, early next week. We'll talk about that as we look at the precipitation forecast. But that trough stays spinning across the western U.S., actually jumps on to the coastline here across Washington, Oregon, Idaho. This is now Sunday, October 12th. We still have ridging downstream of that, keeping those warmer temperatures for the central and eastern part of the country. Keep an eye on that coastal low on Monday. This trough has now absorbed the precipitation plume from Priscilla. Again, we'll check that in a slide or two. And then by Wednesday of next week, almost past a week from now, this trough now centered over Salt Lake City, or like Yosemite. Not Yosemite, Yellowstone, over here in northwest Wyoming, before a piece of it at least comes racing through the upper Midwest, like Wednesday, Thursday of next week. And so that's going to bring a decent chance for showers, precipitation, maybe even storms here for the upper Midwest. Now, it doesn't look like it's going to race in this direction or be one of these big troughs that's going to come through and bring back a lot of rain back to the Ohio River Valley. But at least for the upper Midwest, a good precipitation chance through the middle part of next week with continued cooler weather in the west and precipitation chances there as well. We can see this just on the ECMWF forecast. I'm going to play this forward through the day on Tuesday into the afternoon. You can see those showers across the eastern Corn Belt, across New Mexico that we talked about. Drier, warmer on the backside of this. This is now Thursday, October 9th. Remnants of Priscilla weakening quickly west of the Baja. Now into Saturday, there's that trough. Getting closer to Washington, the Willamette Valley. Some showers and precipitation there. See showers over the Intermountain West, getting into like central and eastern Montana now. This is Sunday. There's that coastal low that we have to keep an eye on, forming very close to the Barrier Islands in North Carolina. Stays kind of just offshore. That would keep some of the heaviest rain, out to sea or even kind of near Cape Hatteras. But this could inch a little bit closer and bring more flooding rains to eastern North Carolina. We'll have to keep an eye on that. But here you can see Sunday. This is the 12th. There's that Priscilla moisture being pushed up into the Arizona, less so in the lower Colorado River Valley, but at least for northern, central, and eastern Arizona, before getting pulled up into southern New Mexico, even like West Texas, the Panhandle on Monday. There's that low that we talked about moving through the upper Midwest on Monday. And then a bigger piece of it moves through on Tuesday and Wednesday before a deeper low pressure system finally finishing up near like Grand Forks. There's Grand Forks again. Maybe even snow on the backside and like almost blizzard-like conditions. This is well out into the forecast, 216 hours, over a week from now. So can't put a firm answer on whether the snow will materialize or not, but it is there in the forecast. And it's a lot of rain out ahead of it as that storm races to the northeast across Ontario. But you'll notice, as I'm kind of playing this through Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it does not have this big southern component to the rainfall with a front moving through. Part of that is, again, that kind of split moisture return out of the Gulf. We just don't have a lot of moisture coming up into this region right now. And that trough was oriented more toward the northeast as it kind of ejected. It's not a great chance for precipitation even into like the Midwest proper or the eastern Corn Belt out into next week when we're going to be warming up again on some dry acreage that maybe missed out on some of the precipitation this week. If we just sum this up over the next 10 days, looking at the precipitation departures from average, this from that same model, the ECMWF, wet in the west, the Willamette Valley, into the Snake River Valley along the kind of continental divide, Arizona, New Mexico, the northern plains, out into the upper Midwest, Twin Cities. You can see that split. You get somewhere south, like Spencer, Iowa. That quarter here staying dry over the next 10 days relative to average. This quarter especially dry, save for the precipitation that's moving through over the next 48 hours here. There's that coastal low. Yeah, we have to keep an eye on. This axis of heaviest precipitation could easily shift, a few hundred miles toward the west or the east. And if this gets a little bit stronger, some of these can, bring some gusty winds to this area here over the Carolinas. I did want to show that Priscilla moisture. Here's that ECMWF forecast for that precipitable water. I'm going to play this forward. See how much anomalous moisture it's picking up, bringing up into Southern California, Southwest Arizona. This is now Saturday, and you can actually see it absorbs this next potential system trying to develop off the coast of Mexico. See, that never really gets going, maybe like a tropical depression before getting wrapped up into Priscilla's kind of influence. And all that moisture getting pushed up into New Mexico, southeastern Arizona, even like West Texas. This would be early next week, and it's just kind of off screen there. If we look a little bit out further into the forecast, looking at our 3 panels of temperatures, we can zoom this in a little bit. Over the next 5 days, that's on the left. Zoom back out just so we can see all 3. Relatively, seasonal, more fall-like across the Midwest and New England, but warming up behind that in the western U.S. and the northern plains. So we get out into next week, warmer for the central U.S. We talked about that ridge building out ahead of that trough over the western U.S. See that warmth there, a little bit cooler on the AFS over the Canadian Prairie. I should say colder at this point in the year. But if you look further out, that third panel on the right, the ECMWF ensemble cooling down across the northern plains again, across the prairie, that 10 to 15 day. The GFS has gone very cool. That 0Z GFS that you can see here. And the ECMWF AIFS comparatively, maybe a little bit more in line with the ECMWF ensemble, cooler in the west, cooler in the plains, cooler in the prairie, but still warm in the central part of the country. Cooler in New England, though. And the ECMWF ensemble a little bit cooler in New England as well. So really it's just the GFS that's bringing this big shot of autumn air through the 17th through the 22nd, again, all the way out to 10 to 15 days. And this has been fleeting. We've seen, it's almost like always one of the models. We even saw it in like early October. Remember, there was a point in like the middle to latter part of September, we saw hints that maybe early October would have a more material cool down. We're seeing here this week that it wasn't very much, enough to bring some frost and freeze advisories to the northernmost counties in the U.S. over toward New England later this week, but not this kind of widespread, first frost across much of the continental U.S. And so I'm hesitant to say, this is a material signal from the GFS that we need to, talk too much about the 17th through the 22nd. It's just too far out and it's been too fleeting right now. And we're lacking a little bit of that long range support, but we'll keep an eye on it. This area tends to go cold first, right before the central or southern part of the country. So that's at least lining up in that kind of third week of October. But again, it's going to sound like a broken record. I said that for parts of the middle of October earlier this month, or like the end of September. And again, the middle part of this month is now in this panel here, and it's looking fairly warm across much of the eastern, like 2/3 of the continental U.S. If we look further out in the ECMWF ensemble, we don't find a lot of answers other than if I take this out to like October 20th, well, we still see generally ridging here over the middle part of the country. There's that kind of cooler New England signal, cooler in the west. We do you see this ridging north of Hawaii, this troughing over the Bering Sea. That's more momentum coming out of the Pacific. Now that can actually bring warmth to the middle part of the country. It can bring more intense precipitation and storms to British Columbia or the west coast. But we are seeing momentum pick up a bit, and it's been relatively low the past kind of 30 to 40 days. So it's interesting to see momentum pick up as we get further into October here. Might spell more inclement weather as we go further along versus what we've had. But if you put a ridge to the south, a trough to the north, between that the jet stream is going to be cranking, and that's what we're looking at for that increased momentum. So this is all the way out like October 20th. If we look at some of these momentum forecasts just for angular momentum across the globe, we can see those coming up around October 20th. They're in the forecast, staying elevated all the way through the turn of the month toward November. So the idea that October may be starting warm, maybe staying warm over the next kind of week or two, is it going to harken a warm November? I don't think that's there. We might be seeing something more of a pattern shift as we get toward November, and that's not uncommon as we translate out of these more kind of calmer fall months toward the more active kind of end of fall. Usually we get some big system through the continental U.S., some big low pressure system near the end of October. If we look out in the MJO for signals, the forecast right now at least takes something of a predictable transition from phase 1 into 2 to 3 this month in October. And that's a little bit different as well. We've seen a lack of coherent MJO signal in September. So now getting into October, and we can at least see something of a real phase transition all the way through the Indian Ocean, gives us at least something to benchmark off of. And at least if we look historically at that same transition around the same time period, let's do like October, let's do the middle of October, and we'll do phase 2. We tend to be warmer, at least more ridging over the eastern U.S. We start cooling off here in that third week of October across the Canadian Prairie, the northern plains. Well, we saw some of that in the forecast if we go back to the 3 panels, out like the 17th through the 22nd. Right, a lot of these models consistent with that cooler temperatures there. And if we bring that all the way out to like phase 3, near the end of the month, that last week of October, tend to get more of that troughing through the middle part of the country, that ridging moving off to the east, potentially bringing temperatures down in the middle part of the country. So there is something of that story there. But again, because I'm sounding like a broken record, I don't want to put too much weight on it right now, but it is something to follow. And at least there's something of a more robust MJO signal. And we have more momentum out of the Pacific, maybe increasing the predictability a bit going forward with the jet stream. So looking at the end of October for something of a pattern change, bringing some cooler weather in. In the meantime, we've got to keep an eye on the tropics over in the Atlantic. I mentioned that tropical wave we're watching way out into the central Atlantic, that has a likely chance of formation over the next 90 days occurring. According to the National Hurricane Center, there's that low percentage chance, just 10% of that system forming in the Bay of Campeche that would likely move quickly west into Mexico as it stands. But if we look at the ECMWF ensemble forecast, all these different members forecasting that current wave over the central Atlantic, well, some of these have a stronger system on the southern kind of flank of that scenario, or that ensemble scenario, making this potential threat for the Lesser Antilles. Most of these members keep the storm out to sea, thankfully, and keeping it well out to sea, even east of Bermuda. Some of these get a little bit closer, but again, we're talking like 1, 2, or 3, and who's to say these don't just recurve eventually out to sea, maybe a slight threat for Bermuda. We're also seeing some of these models try to develop that coastal hybrid load down to like 980 millibars. That would be enough, certainly, to bring some gusty winds, near tropical storm-like conditions to the coastal part of like Virginia and North Carolina. So I'll have to keep an eye out on that early next week. But again, I'm very skeptical right now that anything's going to develop in this region, just given how much we've seen over in the Eastern Pacific. We get further out into the forecast. I've taken this all the way into next week on the 13th. I think that's Monday. Yep. If the Eastern Pacific can quiet down in the middle part of October, I think that puts this region back in play, more of these homegrown systems. We do have a Central American gyre sneaking around here, so I'll have to keep an eye on that. But right now, with the Eastern Pacific as active as it is, I'm just not convinced at the moment. If we look further out into the forecast, this is the ECMWF extended forecast. I know Eric talked about the seasonal yesterday. We're not seeing any major hints of a temperature pattern change, at least from the extended ECMWF model. This is looking at temperature anomalies from October 15th all the way out to November 15th. You still see cooler west, warmer east, kind of that general pattern that we're looking at in the forecast anyway. I will say, if we do stay warm through much of October, I did an interesting thought experiment that if we just kind of find I just did the recent warm Octobers, because at least the forecast right now looks like for the bulk of it, it's going to be warmer for the central and eastern part of the country, at least certainly for the kind of middle part. And I pulled up all these central region warmest Octobers just of the last 20 years. So I'm kind of looking at this region here, and I excluded New England and the eastern U.S. because they're actually forecast to get a little bit cooler here over the next 15 days. Certainly have to exclude the west with how cold they've been. But I pulled up all the warmest Octobers the last 20 years for this corridor here, and I said, what did that ultimate winter end up looking like? So last year, we had a warm October in 24, 25. 21 into 22, 16 into 17, and 07 and 08. And at least for those winters, it ended up being fairly cold for the northern portion of that central region, and we tended to be warm in the southern U.S. And this is a pretty La Nina-like signature anywhere, where we've noted that drier and warmer fall signal in more recent La Ninas. So interesting to think about that. Just because we're warm here now doesn't mean we're going to stay warm going through winter. In fact, some of these winters were fairly cold and brutal in this quarter here. And at least if we take this, verbatim, it would set up, a storm track, something like this, bringing more interesting weather to this quarter here. So something to think about. Just because we're warm here in fall, just because we're dry here in fall, doesn't mean it's going to last over winter. If you're in the southern U.S. staring down this La Nina, right, we tend to see warmer falls here with less precipitation. I'll leave it there. That's my last slide as of today. Thanks for watching. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow morning.